So cognitive dissonance is a feeling of distress, a sinking feeling that we may have when something happens that challenges our core beliefs, and specifically the beliefs that we may have about ourselves as a really smart or competent person, as a very good person, as a very moral person. And so when something happens that really puts a dent in that belief, that's when we go into or can go into that state of cognitive dissonance, which then sort of sets in motion, it makes our brain sort of hyperactive in trying to find a way out.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Today I'm going to be presenting you with an interview we recorded quite some time ago when we were first doing some experimental interviews to try and figure out how the podcast was going to work, what the content was going to be like, and things along those lines. So this is an interview with Sheila Marshall and Kris Meyer. Sheila Marshall is a filmmaker and Kris Meyer is a neuroscientist. And in 2016, they collaborated on and released a documentary called Right Between Your Ears. This is a documentary that follows a religious group in California in 2011 who, because of their leader, Harold Camping, apparently became convinced that there was a fixed date for the end of the world. I think it was in 2012. And so the documentary follows very intimately this group of people as they anticipate and then pass through what they think is going to be Judgment Day. And then in parallel to the story, there's a kind of scientific dissection of concepts like belief and behavior and cognitive dissonance, which is when either some of our beliefs contradict each other or when our beliefs contradict our behavior. And I think this film really does a very rational and humane job of dissecting all of that, like I said, in parallel with a very interesting and compelling story. Nowadays, when, again, more than ever, it seems all of our beliefs are being questioned, our motivations are being questioned, and how we respond to new information is under a microscope, I think this film is more valuable than ever. So if you haven't watched the film, I would urge you to watch it, and you can watch it at www.rightbetween.com, and you can also follow them on Twitter and Instagram at rightbtw. Because this is one of the first interviews we ever did, you might find that there are some audio issues, but they're very mild. And so without much further rambling, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I now bring you Sheila Marshall and Kris Meyer. By breaking down the documentary for someone who's not seen it before.
So Right Between Your Ears is a film about the feeling of being right and why we find it hard to handle being wrong. And we explore it through the story of a group of people who become convinced that they have a date for the end of the world. But what it's really about is how, once we go along with believing something, how we can become more and more convinced of that thing, and then the discomfort that we feel when we're challenged or when evidence comes up to show that we're wrong, or when we've realised we've hurt someone. And social psychology describes that as cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm. So what was happening with the specific group of people you were studying?
So they had become convinced of that 21st of May 2011 would be Judgment Day. And by the time we meet them, which was about 4 weeks before that date, they were very, very convinced that this was going to happen. So when we met them, we were asking them not necessarily what is it that you believe, because that was very incomprehensible to us, but we would ask them, how does it feel to believe this? And what changes have you made to your life? And how did you feel the very first time you heard about this date? And then people would tell us that they were very skeptical in the beginning, but as time went by, they had become more and more convinced. And by the time we met them, they were absolutely convinced that this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I think it changed their lives in quite radical ways, wasn't it? That they sort of, once they incorporated these beliefs, people changed their jobs, quit their jobs. And what I found quite striking was often some of the changes that they made were actually quite beneficial. So people seem to have a bit more perspective because of these beliefs. How do you feel about how beneficial were these beliefs for these people? Do you think it was beneficial for some and not so for others? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it was quite inconvenient. We didn't meet people who were necessarily kind of longing, for the end of the world. It was an inconvenience. They were taking a stand for something that was very strange. They weren't living with kind of a group of people who were always reinforcing, what they believed. A lot of them were living, with family and surrounded by friends and the public who were always challenging them. So in a way, it was a bit difficult.
There also is, on your question of whether it was beneficial to them, I would say there was sort of a mixture of things, because as you pointed out, they were maybe coming closer together with some of their loved ones who were in this with them. Whereas on the other hand, it could also actually introduce lots of tensions with other family members. So one person we met said, like, I've really been struggling with my daughter because she's pregnant and she will have a child pretty soon, and so it's really tough on our relationship. So that was kind of difficult. It was also emotionally sometimes very challenging, especially in the years or months leading up to the date where they had started to believe this. So some of them said, like, it was so difficult for me that in the beginning I stopped sleeping. But then they had somehow become, they've accepted it as a part of their life, and so they've come to terms with it. And by the time we met them, we didn't actually meet a lot of people who were in lots of emotional distress for those reasons. A lot less so than they had been months before or years before. But there still were some tensions with family members often.
Yeah, it's really counterintuitive, because I think a lot of people think that people incorporate the beliefs that are convenient for them. And if this was like a test case, if this group of people was like a petri dish, this proved that often people will take on beliefs which are almost like a burden to bear, if they feel that somehow it fits in with their worldview, although in some cases clearly where they have to restructure their whole worldview. Another question I have is, I mean, I don't know if you guys would use the word cult to describe this group of people. I think that word has been applied to them by other people. And organizations like this are often associated with quite vulnerable people who become followers. Did this strike you as a group of people who, before they started adopting these beliefs, were vulnerable at all?
No, is a short answer to that, really. So one of the characters in our film, at the end in the second part, says, I used to pride myself as somebody who wouldn't fall for something like this. What happened? We were people who had regular jobs and often had kind of good standing in the community. And so, for example, one of our contributors, she was so good at her job that her manager said to her, look, if this doesn't happen, we want you to come back. The people that we spoke to weren't kind of needy or vulnerable in any way. So, yeah, in that sense, it's kind of, they were very different to people you would think would get caught up with, an idea, or other people who have been caught up in cults. This was not a cult in the kind of sense that we often understand what a cult is.
Yeah, so they weren't like a closely knit community that was really under the iron fist of Harold Camping. That wasn't the case, Harold Camping being the main person who originated the Judgment Day prophecy. In fact, there was a New York Times journalist that we met somewhere along the line who had been at Jonestown in the 1970s, which was a cult where people committed mass suicide. And he'd visited that site in probably months or weeks leading up to that. And he said, this is so different from Jonestown. This is nothing like it. So for him, he saw very much the distinction between the group of people that we met and then Jonestown. And of course, there still is like the question, like, were they followers? And there is kind of like, it's a mixed bag. There were some people, specifically those that were living in the area, who you could maybe see a little bit more as sort of classical followers who follow Harold Camping as a person. But there were many people who were from all over the US and who weren't actually like strictly followers of Harold Camping, who were often happy to go against the grain of everyone in their community and would take a stand for this because they had come to believe this. So it really was a mixed bag in that respect, yeah.
And certainly how Harold Camping came across in the documentary, he seemed like he was acting quite in earnest. Certainly, if he was a charlatan, it would be hard to see how he was benefiting really from this process. I think he was described as kind of a family man, quite charismatic, yes, but he seemed to have, the best of intentions. Did you guys spoke to Harold Camping? What did you make of him as a person?
We weren't really there to kind of explore the man, Harold Camping. And funny enough, a lot of people had been listening to family radio for several years. And because of that, when he did come up with a date for the end of the world, their reaction was, hang on, this is a bit way out there. But because we've been listening to family radio for, 15 years, let's look into this. And he was, married to his wife for 60, 70 years. He still, wore suits from Walmart that he had for 10 years, had a car from the 70s. So he was a really humble person who wasn't necessarily focusing on being a big, celebrity. And a lot of people who listen to family radio actually found that aspect of family radio and Harold Camping quite refreshing, because it wasn't a mega, church with a charismatic leader at all. And they would send tracts out to listeners for free. So Harold Camping, in fact, was a very successful businessman who retired at the age of 35 and spent the rest of his years volunteering full-time for family radio. So it really, to us, it didn't seem to be about the money at all.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't fit that typical narrative.
Absolutely, of someone charismatic who's gaining something from it necessarily.
Yeah, so there would certainly be we didn't see any signs of material gain in that process. There is, of course, always something of sort of the validation that you get as a leader or as someone that's being listened to, and perhaps we saw signs of that Harold had trouble admitting he was wrong to people or admitting that he could be wrong. So there's certainly that aspect that maybe was at work. But even then, about a year later, he then finally did admit that it had been a mistake to set dates for the end of the world. So he completely recanted himself at some point.
Mm-hmm. And so that was after your documentary ended. He had there was the date that passed during the filming of your documentary, and then he set a further date, which, as we know, didn't transpire to be the end of the world. And then following that, he sort of sent a blanket apology, is that correct? Saying, I was wrong about setting dates for the end of the world in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah. Look at us, we're an example of what not to do. Do not do this.
That sounds good. Were there a lot of other media organizations interviewing people, Harold Camping, people around Harold Camping while you guys were there?
Yeah, there were loads. So all the big US TV stations came and interviewed him or people around him and did features on the movement in the days leading up to May 21st. On the eve of May 21, we're in a house with a group of believers, and we're waiting for stuff to start happening. And at some point, Sheila hears that there's going to be a feature on CNN. And so she calls them up, and then we start watching it, and it's incredibly mocking of them, which was, we sank into the floor in sort of shame of what the image was that they were being portrayed as. And then the same was happening on Fox. ABC had a feature on them, was more sort of neutral, so there was sort of a mixture of very mocking reports and then sort of more neutral reporting on it. But yeah, all the big TV stations in the US carried it in the days before.
And what I noticed was, obviously, it seems like you guys got really close. You're in their homes on the day when the rapture was supposed to happen. So presumably they must have really trusted you. And what was your approach in getting them to open up so thoroughly?
So we were there before May 21, and we were there for some time afterwards. And there were several other documentarians there as well. But what we found is that people kind of came in and dipped in and then disappeared. But we were kind of a constant presence.
How long were you guys there for?
We were there for just over a month, 6 weeks.
4 weeks before to 2 weeks after.
Sure. And so, yeah, we were just a presence. And also we weren't asking questions that would elicit, the content of their belief. We were really asking about their experience, like Kris was saying earlier before, how did you come across this? How did it feel to believe? What impact has it had? What are you doing? How are you living out your last days? And so I think just as a constant presence. And one thing that happened very near the start of our arrival, is that we went to family radio to meet Harold Campin and Tom, who had become their kind of, press man, and to explain who we were and what we were going to do. And within kind of a minute of explaining, introducing ourselves and explaining that, Tom stopped us and said, look, what you're doing here is between you and God. We just ask that you treat us respectfully. And we were there not to kind of necessarily judge them for what they believed, but really about, like I said, what their experience was. And so I think maybe that allowed them to, open up a little bit more, and we were kind of, Kris and Sheila thing.
Yeah, it was just like, there wasn't, I wouldn't say we did anything specific. We were just there and we connected with them as people. And it was that continuing presence and just being there day after day and being very respectful of them. Because I remember there was a scene where one of them asked us in the first instance to stay away with our camera from her family, because they had quite a few kids, like 6 kids or something, and they were playing in the compound in family radio, and they asked us to keep the camera back. And we did that. We really kept it. And whenever we moved it, we went to ask, is it okay if we go there and whatever? And so after just a very short while, they really opened up as a result of that. And we found then out what the reason was. A TV team had been there a couple of days before and had really been shoving the camera in their face and been really annoying them with the way they were trying to film them and their family and the kids, and had shown absolutely no respect for them as children, as people. And that's why they had become so sensitive to it. But then if you then show that basic respect to them, then they very quickly sort of open up and you had a real just human connection forming.
So it sounds like you guys came from a place of curiosity, and basically you're willing to, at least for a moment, inhabit their worldview. And please, guys, show me how it is that you came to believe what you believe, purely so I can, experience what it's like and hopefully learn something valuable from that. And I think it's quite powerful when people like having someone else interested in their inner world, I think. And it really comes out in the documentary. So getting more to the neuroscience aspect of it, in the documentary, you guys talk about a study, I believe it was an fMRI study, that talks about what beliefs look like in the brain. And Kris, maybe you could take us through that.
Yeah, so this was a study that looked at how different types of beliefs might be either the same or different inside the brain, and also how different people with different sets of beliefs might be either very similar in the way that their brains are responding, or might be dissimilar. So in the first study, they had looked at 5 different categories of belief: moral beliefs, factual beliefs, geographical, mathematical, and personal, I think, and had asked them questions to which some of the questions you answer true and some of the questions you answer false. So those are what we call disbeliefs. Those are things that you don't believe. And then you just look at the difference in brain activity between believing and disbelieving across those different categories. And what they found in that study was that there is something common in that belief and disbelief difference in brain activity. It's the same for all of those different categories of belief. So it doesn't mean that thinking about religion is the same as thinking about mathematics, but it is that believing something versus disbelieving something, that is the same, and irrespective of whether it's a mathematical or a religious statement that you're thinking about. In a second study, they had taken a group of evangelical Christians and a group of atheists, and they had asked them questions about generic beliefs, but also questions about their religious beliefs. And so for the Christians, they would answer them in a certain way, and atheists would answer them in the complete opposite way. Because if you think a question of God is real, the Christian would answer that with true, the atheist would answer that with false. A question like God is a myth, the Christian would answer that with false, and the atheist would answer that with true. What they found in that study is that there really is no difference at the group level between how the brains of atheists and the brains of Christians are deciding between the truth and falsehoods of the things that they're believing in. And one of the reasons why we wanted to bring in that experiment was to sort of bring that sort of understanding of the physical nature of believing into the film, but also to because I personally I like the outcome of that study very much, because it sort of abolishes the boundaries between us. It reduces sort of the distinction between me and my beliefs and you and your beliefs. If on the level of the brain it's actually all pretty much the same, then we should stop sort of hurling insults at each other over our beliefs.
Right, so I guess ideally the hardcore atheist would have loved it if the result of the study was my beliefs light up this logical part of the brain and these religious beliefs light up this other, let's say, more primitive part of the brain in a religious person. But you guys are saying the outcome of that study was like, no, belief neuroscientifically looks very similar across different categories of beliefs and different people.
Yes, it's expressly that difference between believing and disbelieving. So in technical terms, it's the contrast between belief and disbelief. So if you take all of the questions where people answer true and you subtract the brain activity from all of the questions where people answer false, then you get something stable across different people and across different categories.
So what was really great, and when we were making the film, is that one of the believers agreed to take part in that experiment, and even better, he agreed to take part in it before May 21, and then again after May 21, and it was great and interesting to see his response to that as well.
Mm-hmm. That was the university graduate, is that correct?
That's right.
And I think did the brain processes switch over before and after the rapture?
That's an interesting one. So I would have expected that to happen. Like, that was my own hypothesis before we did the study. I thought he's going to just completely switch his answers on the questions around, and we'll see that in the way that his brain activity is recorded at that moment as well. But actually something else happened, which is interesting because it showed that I was wrong in what I was expecting. And so rather than him just flipping his answers, he goes from a state of knowing and a state of being certain about the things that he believes and the things that he doesn't believe, to a state where he actually doesn't know anymore. And so, interestingly, there is actually a study that has been done much more recently that indicates that the certainty versus uncertainty that we have in beliefs is coded separately in the brain from believing and disbelieving. So there's almost like a two-dimensional thing going on where uncertainty and certainty is one axis and believing and disbelieving is the other axis.
Okay, that's really interesting. So there's three components. There's the belief or the disbelief, and then, or other two dimensions. So the belief or the disbelief, and then the level of certainty is another sort of mitigating factor. Okay. The other thing I thought about, let me know what you guys think about this, is what this documentary highlighted to me is that I think there's an implicit assumption that the function of our beliefs is to serve to help our understanding of the objective nature of the world around us. Certainly, I think in the last 100 years, that's what most people tend to assume. What this belief really highlighted is that's part of the reasons why we have beliefs, is to help us determine the world around us. But what you can see so clearly in a lot of the people in the documentary was another part of beliefs is to motivate certain behaviors that can help us in other ways. So, for example, the gentleman who decided to prioritize spending more time with his family as a result of his beliefs in the rapture. It's like the beliefs were a vehicle that allowed him to behave in a way that was ultimately beneficial to him in some way. What do you guys think about that?
So, yeah, there's certainly an aspect to that. So there's a very interesting relationship between our beliefs and our behavior, in a sense that when we are strongly convinced of something, our beliefs are a good indicator of the things that we do. But actually, when we're not strongly convinced of something, our beliefs aren't a good indicator of what we do, and it's actually our behavior and our actions that change our beliefs and may make them stronger over time. So we certainly saw that in the experiences of the people that we met, because we would ask them, how did you feel about this at the very beginning when you first heard this? And then they would say, well, of course I was skeptical. Why would I just accept this date? You know, it sounds really out there. And then they would, because they trusted Harold Camping for lots of other reasons, they would start looking into it. And as they were looking into it, they would gradually, the action that they took of looking into it, they would start to justify that. They would then start to talk to other family members and friends about it. And gradually, their beliefs would shift as a result of the actions they were taking. And so there's that very interesting dichotomy between strong beliefs guide our actions, but actually, when our beliefs are weak, it's our actions that guide our beliefs.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone wants to know sort of the secret of behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, one of their main tenets is that it's not merely your beliefs or your mental attitudes which shape your behavior, but changing your behavior can actually shape your mental attitudes and beliefs. And just knowing that can help you make sort of changes in your life just by acting at the level of behavior alone.
Yeah, that's a very interesting analogy.
Of course, there were people who did look into the belief but ended up not believing it and so rejecting it. There were a lot of people at Family Radio who actually didn't believe in May 21 and actually had a longer history with Family Radio and so wanted to stay to convince anybody else that joined the radio station that, look, this stuff isn't true, we don't believe it. And so that was kind of an interesting thing that was happening. But like Kris was saying, and that alludes to another idea in the film, which is the analogy of the pyramid, that once you go along with the belief, you will act according to that belief and you will justify those actions. And so in the documentary, like Kris was saying, you had people who were looking into it, and then once they went on to believe it, they would be giving out leaflets, they would have May 21 stickers on their cars, they would start wearing T-shirts. And in the case of Caro, the guy who was a stock trader, ended up, with banners and leaflets on the corner of Hollywood and Highland, so taking a very public stand for that belief and justifying that was, the right action to be taken.
Mm-hmm. So once they started investing in their beliefs with action and time, the idea is that it becomes harder and harder for them to rescind their beliefs.
That's right, and often, ending up somewhere where you had no intention of, ending up. And so I guess with Jane, the lady who was a manager in retail, she would never have thought that she would believe in May 21 and quit her job of 18 years.
Mm-hmm. So another thing I want to talk about, another thing featured more in the second half of the documentary once these guys experienced the day where the rapture was supposed to happen, but it didn't happen, is cognitive dissonance. So how would you guys, this is a question for either of you, how would you guys break down cognitive dissonance? Because I think it's an emotion that a lot of people feel, but not a lot of people are able to describe it.
So cognitive dissonance is a feeling of distress, a sinking feeling that we may have when something happens that challenges our core beliefs, and specifically the beliefs that we may have about ourselves as a really smart or competent person, as a very good person, as a very moral person. And so when something happens that really puts a dent in that belief, that's when we go into or can go into that state of cognitive dissonance, which then sort of sets in motion, it makes our brain sort of hyperactive in trying to find a way out. And dependent on how difficult the challenge is, that may take seconds before we find the riposte to someone who said, well, but aren't you a stupid guy? We find a way to deal with that. Or it could take hours and days when we're really trying to work through something that we've done and we don't really find a way out, like when we made some kind of professional mistake and it may sit with us for a long time, specifically for people who work in the medical sector. That could sometimes be really challenging because we are often making sort of life-changing decisions and then have to cope with that when decisions aren't going the way we hope they would be going.
So in the documentary, Carol Tavris, who's one of the social psychologists, likens the feeling of cognitive dissonance to hunger or thirst. It's something that we need to get away from or manage really, really quickly.
So it's like a motivational state.
Right, absolutely. And together with Elliot Aronson, they wrote a book called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. And so in that book, there's loads of examples of people who have been challenged, with evidence or with the fact that their belief or a practice has hurt people, and what their reaction to that is. A lot of the time, an unhelpful reaction to cognitive dissonance is denying the evidence and still maintaining the idea that you are right and the evidence is not correct.
Mm-hmm. So there's like a healthy way of responding to cognitive dissonance and perhaps a less healthy way. Like the example I always use is someone who smokes. They're aware that smoking is bad for them, so the cognitive dissonance is arising because their behavior is in direct contradiction to their beliefs. And rather than changing their behavior, which would be, let's say, the healthy way of managing their cognitive dissonance, they just change their beliefs and say, oh, well, the fact that smoking is bad for you is just a conspiracy invented by doctors. And similarly, it could be another scenario where it's changing the behavior. That could be the sort of unhealthy route. But I think having an understanding of that this is the sort of this unstable motivational state, and being willing to challenge either your behavior or beliefs in the path that might be more beneficial is really important.
Yes, that's correct. So Carol Tavris says in the documentary that we have that choice of denying the evidence, but we could also say, actually, I did something that was wrong, or I had a belief that was foolish and that now the evidence shows is wrong. So rather than denying this, and rather than giving up my belief in myself as a smart person or a good person, I can say I did something that was wrong or hurtful, but what can I learn from that to help me avoid making that same mistake in the future? And it's kind of a bit more of a mindful approach where you accept the pain and the hurt that comes with that. And then you say, like, okay, I've done this. I can't keep on banging my head against the wall about this, but what can I learn from this so that I don't make the same mistake in the future?
So it's kind of like allowing a separation between your behavior or your beliefs and yourself. Because I think a lot of people, and this I guess would be one of the tenets of mindfulness, is a lot of people over-identify with their thoughts, over-identify with their emotions, over-identify with their behavior. And what we're saying here is you are not merely the sum of all those things, but all those things could change at a moment's notice if you made a decision for them to change. And that ultimately is, I guess, what you would consider the process of maturation.
Sure. And another thing, together with what can I do in order to avoid making the same mistake again, is what can I do to put this right? What can I do to mitigate the impact of this mistake? So
it sounds like this was quite an important life experience for both of you guys. It sounds like it would have been for me. How has this making this documentary changed the way you look at the world or changed your own behavior?
That's an excellent question. So indeed, it was a life-changing experience. And in the beginning, when we were doing it, it often felt incredibly exhausting because of the way that you're trying to. We completely sort of took our own perspective out of the picture in the weeks that we were there, and then would sit in a cafe, sort of recovering from trying to live in someone else's thoughts and the way that they see the world. And then when we came out of that, we sort of, before we went, I already had sort of the idea that these people would be very much thinking that they had the truth about things and that they had a very good set of ideas why they were believing this. But going there and being there for 6 weeks actually made that even stronger, that understanding that everyone who lives in the world and who takes a strong position on something, that they actually at least think that they have very good reasons for doing that. So it didn't make me a relativist at all. I'm not saying that all beliefs are equal, but I am seeing that everyone who holds beliefs, that they are doing so because they think that they have good reasons for it. And so it makes you less judgmental of other people. And it does also help with even like interpersonal reactions, because when someone says something and you sort of feel that you're responding in an angry way, you go like, hold on, let's take a step back and let's not take this in a way that's going to lead to some kind of fight or a discussion with someone.
Yeah, I think A practical example that I sometimes give is when we were making the documentary, just the process of editing, we had over 100 hours of footage and we've got a 63-minute documentary. That is kind of, a lot of work. And for many sort of months, I was sort of sitting down trying to make sense of this footage. And so it became quite precious. And Kris is a co-producer, so he's got to watch it and it's got to fit in with the vision. It's got to kind of make sense. Sometimes there are challenges. There might be something that he would disagree with and I would disagree with him. And so because we'd been living in this world of, what is cognitive dissonance, our conversations changed. So, what's wrong with you? This is fine. Change to, okay, I'm feeling a little bit of dissonance here, but that's fine. And then we'd have a laugh about it. But what it indicated is that there's something in this part of the documentary that is not working. We don't know what it is. We will think about why it is. Is your challenge a valid one? And, what's the solution? Because obviously the rest of the documentary works. It's just this bit. And, is there a case for bringing someone in to maybe change our way of thinking or giving us a different perspective through which we can be more creative about solving this problem. So that's one example of the application of what we've learned in the documentary. And I think another one is, just as Kris was saying, when you're, being less judgmental with people who disagree with you. And I know that because our beliefs are tied up to our self-concept, that actually me coming in quite forcefully and challenging you is not going to create a space when you can think that I don't want to make you, look like an idiot or show that you're wicked, but that actually, maybe there is something wrong with what I'm saying. I'm going to go away and think about it, and actually let's separate ourselves from what's being said and take it in its merit.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's something about realizing that the way you perceive the world, because of the limited nature of our perceptual systems, we only perceive the world as a model of the world, and our model is very flawed and very limited. And all day we're just interacting with people who have their own very flawed, very limited models of the world. And yet, if you look at our language, like you said, we're tied up in it. It's tied up in our self-concept. We say things like, what's wrong with you? You behaved in this sort of way on this micro level, and now I'm going to go from there to challenging what's wrong with you as a human being. And we do that with ourselves as well as with other people. You see it in couples all the time, for instance. And I guess part of it is just keeping it to the micro level. So not what's wrong with you as a human being, but what's wrong with this small piece of behavior, and how did I contribute to this? And how can we work on it, pragmatically and make a compromise?
Absolutely. And of course, you'll get caught up and you will, I still have arguments with people, but then there are things like saying sorry.
Apologies do help.
Yeah, apologies can be quite helpful.
So I guess what's someone who's seeing the documentary now for the first time, what do you want them to take away from it?
Well, we had a set of hopes before we started making a documentary, and we are getting from our audiences that those hopes are working for quite a few people. So one of the things that I am very keen on people to take away is to be less judgmental of people who have beliefs that are very different from our own. And in this day and age of political polarization, that's becoming more and more difficult. There is more fighting between different people on different ends of the political spectrum, even than there was in 2011 when we started making a documentary. So the polarization has increased. And I would hope that our documentary could actually help to reduce that, to get that sort of devil back into the box, the genie back into the box. That's one thing. There is also something that people get out of the film, which is about the responsibility for the consequences of our actions and the consequences of our beliefs. So far too often today, we think in terms of freedom of speech as a right that everyone should be able to exercise. I fully agree with that, but rights do come with responsibilities, and the question of responsibility for the beliefs and the words that we use is absent from much of that conversation about the freedom of free speech. So I would also like that for people to connect with that message as well.
So you're kind of promoting an actual self-examination and again, this is something no one talks about. Why do I hold the beliefs that I hold, whatever it happens to be? How is this belief translating into behavior? And then what kind of effect is this behavior having on other people? Do you guys have any thoughts on why things have become so polarized? Because self-evidently, that seems to be the case. I mean, I can't see a clear reason why. I do think perhaps the internet had something to do with it. I see the internet as having like this dual role. On the one hand, information is democratized. Everyone has access to information about whatever they want, and it can be long-form information, nuanced information. At the same time, it's kind of fueled this process of allowing people to construct whatever reality suits them. I mean, there were days, where there were 3 news channels, and now you can get news from an infinite variety of sources. So people are constructing models that are, I guess, increasingly atomized, and that seems to be causing a lot of friction. What do you guys think? Do you have any thoughts on how or why things have become so polarized?
Yeah, I think another thing about helpful aspect of understanding how cognitive dissonance works, and the ideas of that your beliefs have consequences, and the context we live in terms of being really connected. You can easily connect to people who believe the same things as you, and what comes up on your news feed, are things that you've looked into before, things that are suited to you, and so we can kind of be in a chamber where our beliefs and convictions are reinforced. And so there's nothing, so I think that in terms of social media, that it kind of
creates that echo chamber.
Yeah, absolutely, that echo chamber. But that makes, I think, a strong case of not being too uncomfortable with people who disagree with you, because maybe there's something that they're experiencing as a consequence of your conviction, or maybe they can point out something that you've not considered, whereas if you knew about it, you would moderate what it is that you believe in. So there is a case for avoiding surrounding yourself with people who will just reinforce your beliefs, and not being uncomfortable, or just being at peace with the discomfort that you will feel with people who disagree with you.
Yeah, that's really true. No one's happy. Just like me and you sit in a room, we're talking about, doesn't matter what it is, and no one can politely disagree anymore. And it's, it's a shame, because that disagreements that can be carried out in a civil way are like the fuel for change, or the fuel for improvement. But it's like we're not getting that inoculation to disagreement that we used to.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I also see at work. One is that once you have people whose understanding of the world really atomizes and moves far apart, language starts to break apart, and the words that you're using start to mean different things in different communities. And so you start disagreeing with each other because you're using language it's not just about it being offensive. It really means something completely different to one group than it does to another group. So one example is that human rights are on the left of the political spectrum, sort of one of the only moral currencies allowed in discussion, whereas on the right of the political spectrum, human rights are starting to mean misuses by people of the system that prevent hate preachers from being extradited out of the UK, for instance. That's what human rights starts to mean in that context. So then when you're on the left framing your entire message in human rights, then there is just no way that you can connect with people on the other side of the political spectrum anymore. And you then start to really, because we are living in our communities of people who are like-minded, and we don't know personally anyone anymore, or very few people who are of a very different disposition, and the only place where we get in contact with them is on social media. When that absence of personal contact and the absence of personal relationship is there, then our social brains go in overdrive and start seeing lots of bad intentions into those people that we're disagreeing with. And then you start focusing on all the bad stuff that comes from the other side. So to use the language of a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, he says, like, we're exposed to the sewer of the stuff from the other side. And that happens on both sides. It's not just something that... Yeah, yeah. So you get all the only stories that cross over from one community to another one are the ones that really spark outrage in one community, because that's when something goes viral, when it either fits with your beliefs or when it sparks outrage. Those two stories are the ones that spread like wildfire, and that means that you don't get exposed to the meaningful stories of people on the other side of the political argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd never thought about that, about the language. There's a list of words I could probably reel off that 50% of people would react with like violent rage, and then the other 50% would react with like pleasant, positive emotions. If I said the word like conservative or alt-right or divorce laws, it would just, these are kind of like radioactive words which spark off completely different emotional reactions. And like you said, because language is the only way that we relate to each other, it's quite a fundamental problem if the goal is to try and allow people to communicate more and have their beliefs exist in harmony, despite the fact that there are contradictions between them. So I'm conscious of your time, but I'd really encourage people to go and find this documentary. Where can they access it?
It's on watch.rightbetween.com. You can access it there. You can also get it on Amazon UK and Amazon US.
That's great. And is there anything you guys are working on at the moment that you'd like to talk about?
So my next documentary is called Nobody Left to Hate, and it's about a social psychological intervention that happened in Austin, Texas in the 1970s, where desegregation was forced and it was a disaster. So Elliot Aronson, who's in Right Between Your Ears, he was living in Austin, Texas at that time. And the right people were in place to invite him to come in and help the situation. So he was invited to go in to find out what the problem was, and consult social psychology and experiments in the past and come up with a way to turn that situation around.
And have you filmed the documentary yet?
Yeah, so I filmed quite a bit of it, but I'm still in production, and there's a more kind of research and filming that I need to do.
That sounds great. And Kris?
I'm mostly involved at the moment in using the insights that the film generates and applying them in different areas. So, for instance, I do a lot of work in science communication these days, where I teach other scientists some of the psychology that's in the film and some of the psychology that's not in the film that's relevant to science communication, to help them better understand their audiences, especially in controversial scientific topics where they're getting a lot of backlash from parts of the general public. And it really helps. It helps people to be less judgmental. It helps scientists to be less judgmental when they do sort of get a backfire reaction to what they believe are straightforward facts. But it's never straightforward facts when you're putting in the things that matter to people's lives. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I'm working on.
What we're also really excited about is, the fact that the film's available for festivals and for universities. Universities can license it, as can schools, and community organisations as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can organise a screening with the film. So do get in touch with us at info@rightbetween.com.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.